it's not enough just to deal with uncompensated care with regard to people who are uninsured. Because remember, we saw that part of that money from the private sector cost shifting has to go to essentially subsidize people on Medicaid and Medicare. So what could you do with regard to those programs? Okay? Well, with regard to Medicaid, what you could do is one of two things. One thing would be to say to people who are currently on Medicaid, we're going to treat you the same way that people who are uninsured are treated. In other words, go out into the private market and we're going to subsidize. You're going to give you a premium subsidy. Probably on Medicaid it will be 100% premium subsidy to buy health insurance. So we would then have an equivalency. People on Medicaid would no longer be going through the process of getting reimbursed through the state and the government and so forth. They'd be basically getting private insurance, just like people who are currently uninsured are being shifted over to get private insurance, just like everybody else. Okay? And the point would be, of course, that that private insurance, just like the private insurance that would be given to those who are currently uninsured, would provide accurate, normal compensation to the providers. Another alternative would be to use the funding, part of the funding from this withhold mechanism, to raise the provider reimbursement rates under the existing program so that they were in accordance with the normal rates of compensation and would actually cover the costs of seeing people on Medicaid. Now, how would you do this? Well, in order to avoid a big sticker shock of increases in premiums, you wouldn't want to simply start saying that the full cost of covering Medicaid should be covered through the withhold. Instead, what you would do is you would say you require what's known as a maintenance of effort. In other words, the same general fund revenues that are now being spent on Medicaid. Medicaid is a matching grant program, which means it's partially funded by the federal government, partially funded by each state. And if you said that the same amount of money that is currently being spent by a state for its Medicaid program, that state has to continue to spend out of its general fund revenue. And the same thing with regard to the federal government. Then you use the withhold mechanism, which remember, all it's doing is it's substituting for the private sector cost shifting that's going on right now. We're just taking that same money, and instead of having the provider cost shifted over to cover Medicaid patients, we're taking that money through the withhold and using it to pay, to increase the reimbursement rates, directly or indirectly, to cover that cost. Okay? You would use that withhold mechanism to make up the difference in the reimbursement rates. And this is critically important, cover future increases in healthcare costs. So in other words, you would essentially freeze the general fund revenues that are coming from the state and the federal government to pay for Medicaid at the same nominal amount. The result would be that in future years, you would see a decrease in the percentage of general fund revenues for Medicaid. Well, why is that? Well, let's just think about it for a moment from the perspective of the federal government. We're constantly seeing, obviously, increases in inflation. We're seeing increases in tax revenue. The federal budget keeps growing and growing and growing. If you have the same amount of money in nominal dollars frozen, that's going to become to shrink as a percentage of the pie. The same amount of money, but because the pie itself will be bigger, it will decrease as a percentage of government revenue. And this is a fundamental reform that would deal with many of the difficulties that governments are facing with government deficits and so forth that are related to health care. Let's apply it to Medicare. Okay? Medicare is funded by a payroll tax. And one would assume that that would continue. However, in order to bring the reimbursement rates up from what they currently are, which again is about 91% of the real cost, to 100% of the real cost, you could use money from the withhold to pay for those to bring those reimbursement rates up to the norm. Once more, remember, that's money that's currently being spent to bring those reimbursement rates up to the norm through private sector cost shifting. Okay? You're not talking about new money. You're talking about the same money allocated more efficiently and in a more rational method. Okay? And this would create a partial solution to the looming entitlement crisis with regard to Medicare. Not a full solution, but a partial one. Because essentially what you'd be doing is you'd be significantly replacing reliance on general fund revenues with a dedicated and a self-regulating source for healthcare funding. Now, I just said that that would be a self-regulating force. What do I mean by that? Well, we have to remember that when employers, predominantly, individuals also, but predominantly employers, are making decisions about their insurance that they're going to order for their workers, they constantly have to balance costs and benefits. And the issue, is as people do whenever they purchase anything. And if, in fact, over time, an employer, in effect, provides health insurance that is very, very costly, particularly as compared to other competitors, over time, that's going to chip away at the profitability of the company, and unless some adjustments are made, it could lead to bankruptcy. And we're seeing this right now, for example, with the automobile firms, the American automobile firms, where one of the major reasons why some of them are staring bankruptcy in the face is because of retiree health care costs. Okay? But notice, and this is particularly important from a pro-life perspective, it also operates the other way. Because if a particular employer's health care benefits are too meager, too tough an HMO, let's say, so that employees are very unhappy with the care that they're getting, then there's an incentive for those employees to move to a competitive source of employment that has a better health care plan. So as occurs across the board, there is this sort of inherent balancing of benefits and costs that occurs in millions of different decisions that ultimately makes up a collective whole. Now, here's the critically important point. To the extent that we're using the cost-shifting approach to fund subsidies for people who are not fully able to pay for their own health care, what that does is that is obviously increasing the cost of the premiums for people who are privately insured, just as it occurs right now. And what that means is that the cost of subsidizing people who can't fully afford their health care is taken into account in that balancing of costs and benefits. They don't think about it. That's not what they're thinking when they're sitting down looking at it. But in effect, you're forcing employers and others who buy insurance to take into account the cost of subsidizing people who are unable to fully pay for health care themselves when they're making their own health care decisions. And the result of that is twofold. On the one hand, unlike artificially imposed constraints that the government might impose, healthcare can actually expand to the full extent the economy through productivity increases allows. As productivity increases, free up more resources that people can put into premiums, the premiums will rise, the healthcare will rise to cover it. But while it rises, because that cost shifting is a percentage of that will go over, it will subsidize the people who are unable fully to afford that health care. So their boat will rise with everybody else's boat. On the other hand, there's an inherent check in preventing spending on health care to go beyond what the economy can actually afford. Because again, as those employers, especially, are making these decisions about the health care costs, they can't ultimately pick health care plans that exceed their ability to stay in business. So what we have is an approach that, when I say it is self-regulating, I mean precisely that. Instead of sitting down and having members of Congress or the state legislature vote about how much money to spend in health care, we have this sort of inherent way of ensuring that people who are unable to fully cover their costs of health care are kept up to a decent standard with everybody else, and then we let the process, the ordinary market, regulate how much ultimately is spent on health care for everybody. Another critically important point is that because people are paying for private sector cost